Okay, afternoon class. We're going to talk about the second constitutional settlement today, and we're going to look at it in the kind of overarching structure of Augustus's power and how that worked. Now, just to start, first of all, with our syllabus and remind you of a couple of things. We are told that we need to look at the consolidation of power, especially after Actium. We've already looked at the first constitutional settlement, and now today we're going to be picking up at 23 BCE with the second constitutional settlement. We're going to look at some of the details, and in particular these two things, the Maius Imperium Proconsulare and the Tribunicia Potestas. We're also going to talk about Autocratus, because that often can be your counter-argument against the actual systemic nature of his power. And we're going to talk about his constitutional position after 23 BCE, because that's going to take us on to the adjustment of the constitutional settlement. But of course we have to look very closely at these assassination attempts and these conspiracies, although I warn you in advance, the details are extremely sketchy. We also have to study the relative power of Augustus in the Senate. I've made a separate video on that, which you can watch on YouTube. The roles of the senators and the equites, well, I'll touch on that today. And we have talked about the imperial and senatorial provinces. You know that Egypt is his piggy bank, that it's absolutely essential to him. Do not forget that no senators are allowed to visit Egypt without prior written permission from him. So that's absolutely key. So today I'm going to look at the conspiracies, then res gestae, limitations of the first settlement, the terms of the second settlement. This will be very important. Honors and titles that he rejects and which he does not mention in res gestae. Then we'll look at the adjustments to the settlement. We will look at this wonderful title of Pater Patriae in 2 BCE. We'll go back to Tacitus, and then we will conclude. So beginning now with the Capio conspiracy, we've already done a lesson on this. So I just want to remind you of 3 key questions. Why was this primus affair so embarrassing? You will recall it was so important to Augustus that he appeared in person at the primus trial. And this is what led to the rift with Murena. He was asked what he was doing there. Now, if we see this as exposing the machinery of government, we see how he is going beyond Autocratus at this particular moment and actually wielding power in the court and undermining the legal system. This obviously goes contrary to res gestae, where he says in res gestae he exceeded none in terms of potestas. Here we see that he is controlling the courts, and it seems to confirm Tacitus' position that the mixed constitution of Rome has been violated, and that the executive is moving into the legislature in this particular case, yeah? And then this is the key question, is how much should we read into these conspiracies? And the second question, is this evidence of widespread dissatisfaction with Augustus? Well, there's a hell of a lot of historical debate about that. And I think all we need to know for this exam is that it is evidence of dissatisfaction. It is contradiction against res gestae of the universal consent. It takes us back to 32 BCE, where we know that Socius, who was the consul, and Ahenobarbus walked out of the Senate and were violently threatened and left to go to the east with 300 senators. So we see a pattern then of dissension. As always for your AO2, it's very important to remind the examiner that you understand that the sources are biased, that many of them had been rooted out by Augustus. So why this is so significant is it's evidence of dissension. It's evidence of lingering republican feeling. And that's really important. I think Tacitus picks up on that a great deal. So looking at res gestae, chapter 34, we know the infamous phrase that he uses. He had extinguished civil wars, and at a time with universal consent, that's our key phrase, Well, immediately we can see then, going back to Capio, that there was no universal consent. So it's normal to engage in hyperbole, but you might argue that this hyperbole is so great as to render res gestae as a piece of propaganda. Again, very important in terms of the AO2 that we're evaluating the validity of the text, yeah? He says, doesn't he, I transferred the Republic from the power to the dominion of the Senate and the people of Rome, using beautiful Republican language there, and very much agreeing with the official version of the first settlement that we saw last time, that he went to the Senate and he relinquished all power. But what we're going to see, and we're going to see it when the succession happens with Tiberius, that there's a pattern of supposedly relinquishing power and ending up with a great deal more power. Just in terms of the honors and the symbols, it's very important that we look at the symbols that he chooses. The civic crown, which we think is a beautiful symbol, because it's both monarchical and republican. It is a crown, but it is a civic one. And we know that the golden shield, which we'll see later in the Aeneid, seems to resemble, doesn't it, the shield of Aeneas. The golden shield, which is really important to him, with the inscription, courage, clemency, justice, and piety. And we've talked before about how important these symbols are in terms of securing his auctoritas. I want to remind you of auctoritas, and to say why it's so important is you often get questions on how important were the settlements, or how important was this particular reform. Don't forget that in addition to the institutional power, the systemic power, the potestas, auctoritas is just, if not more, important. One of the problems with the succession that we've discussed already is because the powers are so personalized and revolve so much around influence, they become very difficult to hand on. And that will be one of the key problems with the succession, won't it? Now, I thought I'd just remind you of what a good paragraph looks like. So I've said here, the Primus trial and the Capio conspiracy certainly suggest that there was opposition to the Augustan regime from some members of the Senate. I wanted to remind you that it's really important in the main body of your paragraph to show ample knowledge of the sources. So I speak here of Suetonius chapter 19, about the opposition of Lepidus, Marina, Capio, Rufus, and some lesser conspiracies. So it isn't only the Capio conspiracy that's mentioned. There are, in fact, 4 named conspiracy as well as some unspecified ones. You might not say that that is a significant amount. It doesn't seem to involve a huge number of senators, but it is significant to us because it contradicts res gestae. It provides you with the argument to criticize res gestae. This is not universal consent. And as I say here, yet this does not directly contradict Augustus' sweeping claim. I transferred the Republic from my power to the dominion of the Senate and the people of Rome. And picking up on that particular phrase, universal consent again. And then I've brought in Tacitus. Whenever we are looking for an arch critic of the Principate and of Augustus, we reach for Tacitus. In those 10 short chapters, he absolutely slates Augustus, doesn't he? And here I've used perhaps his most famous phrase, that he took unto himself the functions of the Senate, the magistracy, and the legislature. Let's not forget, we looked at Polybius very quickly last time, at this idea of the separation of powers, of this mixed constitution. Here, Tacitus is directly refuting the idea that the Principate had this separation of the powers of state. He's always arguing that all the powers become centered in the one man, in the executive, in Augustus. So what were the problems with the first settlement? We know that it actually gave Augustus an enormous amount of power. It gave us that name, Augustus. Don't forget how important that name was. You know, it has associations with religion, with wisdom, with rituals, with reverence. It's an absolutely key name, and it shows how the autocratus is systematically and meticulously built up by things like naming, statues, buildings, literary references, etc. So the problem with this settlement, though, in spite of the fact that it did give him so much authority, especially in his own provinces, is that, as I said before, it wasn't really very codified. A lot of it seemed to rest on short-term grants of power and fairly nebulous ideas of power. So we know that in 23 BCE he became extremely ill, nearly died, and that he gave his signet ring to Agrippa. We also know that the Capio conspiracy and the Primus trial rocked the foundations of the Principate. Now, we don't know the exact date of the Capio conspiracy. For instance, we don't know if the Capio conspiracy happened and then the second settlement happened, or whether the Capio conspiracy followed the second settlement. If it happened before the second settlement, we could see the second settlement as the result of the conspiracy. If it happened after, we could see the Capio conspiracy as evidence of dissension and dislike of the concentration of power into Augustus. We also know that there was dissatisfaction with this kind of monopoly on the consul role. We know that he had been a consul by 23 11 times. We also know that Agrippa had been the consul 3 times during that period, and that his other allies had also monopolized the consul role. So this appears, and I think I should use like modal language, it seems that this was creating a great deal of dislike in the aristocracy, the aristocratic Senate. And I guess another thing is that he did actually need more potestas to complement his auctoritas, because, as I said before, these powers, he took no powers for life, so he was actually beholden to the Senate in theory, and also many of the powers weren't really systematized. Now, I've called the slide From Consul to Tribunicia Potestas. And why this is so important is we all know that in 23 BCE, Augustus does one of his pieces of theatre. He lays down the consulship and says, I will never be consul again. I don't want these consul powers. Okay? He resigns them. And this obviously then opens up positions to senators so that they can become consul. In theory, a consul is the highest status person in the Senate. And so it would appear, by taking on the Tribunicia Potestas, that he is actually downgrading his position. There's another thing that I wanted to point out that's really important, is that he does not accept the position of tribune. And he was offered the position of tribune in perpetuum, forever. He turns it down. And this is the key thing, is to remember the potestas part of the title. He's not taking the office, he's taking the powers of the office, which means you can still have a tribune of the plebs. In fact, he increases the number of tribunes to 10. So he's opening up new positions. In terms of the cursus honorum, there are all the avenues to power and promotion are there, and they're being opened up. Now, we know that he reduces the number of senators, but we also, if you recall, will remember that there is a vast increase in status in terms of the Senate. So I want you to see that in many ways he's deferring to the Senate. Now, this video is not about his relationship to the Senate, but I want to remind you how different it was from his adoptive father. He never disrespects the Senate in this period. We know earlier He treated them with violence and intimidation. But now he can name each man. Now he defers to the Senate. We see in Res GESTAE that he talks all the time of working in accordance with the Senate. So it's about appearance, and so much of his power is about camouflage, isn't it? So he gets the Potestas, and this gives him the right to veto any actions of the magistrates. But here's the thing, class. He doesn't use them. He doesn't need to use them, even though that power is so important. Now, the second major power that we need to know about, and it's as important in some ways, is the Imperium Maius Proconsulare. Now, you will recall that we have the senatorial provinces and we have the imperial provinces. So arguably, one of the missing bits of Augustus's power is how does he overrule the governors in the senatorial provinces? And this is partly what the Primus trial was about, wasn't it? You know, it was about, was Augustus interfering in the provinces which in theory weren't his? Now, of course, as this suggests, Imperium being power, Maius being greater, his power is greater than the power of the governors in the provinces. So it trumps them. So does he get rid of the proconsular power? No. And this is his whole model, isn't it? The existing apparatus remains. What does he do? He just adds a layer on top of it. So important in terms of the patterns. Another very important thing is previously his power did not extend beyond the Promerium, the outskirt of the city. When he left, in theory, he lost a lot of his power. Now that boundary no longer exists. He retains his power, and he has the right to intervene in other provinces. Now, this beautiful item that you can see on the right of my screen is the Edicts of Cyrene. Do you remember those? And what you need to remember about those is what they show is, even though that's a senatorial province, guys, Augustus says, I have read this particular case, and it would be my advice that Now, why this is so significant is twofold. It shows that he's still making decisions in the senatorial provinces, but just like Res GESTAE, he is couching them within the language of advice. And this, again, would fit in with his claim that he works through auctoritas rather than the potestas. So soft power rather than the hard power. Now, it's very important that we know some of the titles and the honors that he refused. This tells us a great deal. What he rejects is as, if not more important than what he accepts. Now, I think this is the most important one. No powers for life. Contrary to Julius Caesar. We could argue that that's what killed him. Dio and Suetonius both confuse this and say that he took some powers for life. He did not. And that's very interesting that they confused it, because it shows how ambiguous his powers were and how really in many ways they were quite shadowy and not really consolidated. We know that he rejects the triumvir office in 32 BCE. We talked before about the fact that we don't really know the nature of his power in that year. But he revokes all of the edicts of the triumvirate. And he does that in preparation to adopting his new cloak, which is the cloak of the restorer of the Republic. He's offered the dictatorship for life. Unlike Julius Caesar, he rejects it. You will recall that Julius Caesar on the Lupercals offered the crown by Mark Antony, which he rejects. He says he thrice rejects it. I don't think that Augustus would have even let it get to that stage. We know that he eschews all of the language and symbolism of monarchy. which is why he rejects the title of Romulus and that of Rex, or king. We know that he rejects the consulship, as I say, in 23 BCE, which is the second settlement. We know that he refuses to be the perpetual tribune in 23 BCE and accepts the Potestas, as I have explained, instead. We know, according to Suetonius, that he rejects divinity. He does not want to be worshipped, although you'll recall it was very common to have temples and shrines to him in the East. But in Rome, there was an ironclad law that you could not worship at any altar to him, although towards the end of his life he starts to change that. He's also offered the position of perpetual censor, which he declines. He does actually conduct the censor, and the census, I should say, on the lustrum on a number of occasions, but he does so through his powers as a tribune, not his power as a censor. He's also offered the position of permanent supervisor of laws and morals in 19 BCE, which he rejects. Suetonius gets this wrong in chapter 27. He rejects the office. He does pass moral laws, the Lex Julia that many of you know about, but once again he does that through the position of tribune, not through the position of censor. And don't forget how clever he is with the Pontifex Maximus. He could have taken off Lepidus immediately, but he shows great patience and he waits till Lepidus dies, doesn't he? In the meantime, he's accrued many positions of the priesthood, and the Pontifex Maximus by 12 BCE will be the final piece of the jigsaw. But importantly, in terms of optics, he now looks like he is not a greedy, power-grabbing guy like his adopted father was. Here he is, almost reluctantly taking this position and waiting for Lepidus to die, even though Lepidus had betrayed him. So again, we're talking about changing his image to that of one of Clementia. He's no longer the enfant terrible, the Octavian who threatens the Senate. Now he is the man who respects traditions and reluctantly takes office when he is needed. Now, a further thing that you'll find very interesting is also around this time he starts to give provinces back. You will recall, class, that he takes on the imperial provinces because he says they are filled with civil war, they're in a state of danger. I will take these on. The whole of Res Gestae is about, I will take on these public works. I will take on the corn supply. This is my burden of office. So in 23 BCE, he returns Cyprus and part of Gaul as well. In addition to this, he splits Calabria and the Iberian Peninsula, Hispania. He splits that into two and gives part of it to the Senate. Now, why would he do this? He does this to show them that he doesn't want these provinces forever. He's simply taming them and making sure that when they're safe, they can be given back to Res Publica. Very, very clever, I think, yeah? The historian Jones, however, says that after 23 BCE, Augustus's autocracy is absolutely assured. So we have this appearance of giving back power, of relinquishing power, of not wanting to be an autocrat, but beneath this, many historians feel that it's actually a consolidation of power. Now, the tribune office is really important because he could have used this office a lot more. Augustus never vetoed anything. He doesn't use the power. In 18 BC, like I said, he passes all the Lux Julia, the moral and social laws. He doesn't use the power. After this, after 18 BC, he never uses his tribune powers again. So my point being is that the kind of careful exercise of his power means that he doesn't throw it in the face of the Senate that they do not have very much power. He preserves the appearance, the veneer, the facade, that the Republic is still operating. And we know that that's very important to him in Res Gestae, where he frames himself as the restorer of the Republic. Now, you would think by 23 BC, following the second constitution, that everything was hunky-dory. However, and this is what's really interesting, the people are furious following that. And it shows how successful his charade was. The people want him back as consul, particularly as when he goes away and only returns in 19 BCE, there's been famine and riots in Rome. And it shows the popular support for Augustus and confirms a lot of what he says in Res Gestae about being a popular leader, seen as a benefactor to the people. Another thing that you will remember is that Fasti Capitolini is where he builds that, and he allows all the triumphs to be written down. And the last one was, can anyone remember? Balbus. Importantly, Balbus will also be the last private citizen who is allowed to build a public building. Thereafter, only Augustus is allowed to build. Yes, Monroe? A theatre, a magnificent theatre that was in the Campus Martius, and it complemented the theatre of Marcellus. But thereafter, even if you wanted to give to the public and give gardens and buildings, etc., not allowed to, just like the triumphs. So there's a kind of monopoly on the love of the people, isn't there? So we've got after this adjustment, some people call it a third constitutional settlement. We've decided, haven't we, that it's more of an adjustment. We've got the powers united. He's got the tribune, he's got the censorship, and he also has the consul powers. Because once again, class, this is the important thing. Is he a consul? No. Where does he sit? In between the consuls, carrying the consul insignia, having the powers of a consul, but not being a consul. So we see this fantastic simulation then, don't we? This is the camouflage, okay? And what that means is, on the surface, he is seen not to be breaking the rules of the Republic. It's almost like what Jean-Paul Sartre would call bad faith, where you pretend something is not happening. So the Senate could pretend that the Republic was operating, and Augustus could sit there and pretend that he doesn't have all of the powers. And that makes this kind of autocracy far more palatable. So in Res Gestae, what is not mentioned? The powers of the tribune, the power of the consul. These are not Republican officers, so they're left out. So do you remember we talked before about absence in Res Gestae, if anything, is more important than presence. So this elision, this leaving out of things, is very important. What is included in Res Gestae is a sense of all the public service, isn't there? The building, the corn dole, the large amounts of gifts of money, etc. The Republican symbolism of shields and oak wreaths and crowns that are not of precious metals. And of course, this very important title, the Pater Patriae, given in 2 BCE. Now, why is it always... I love this photo of Mommsen. He looks like an absolute madman, doesn't he? Maybe that's what happens to people who spend all their time reading Latin. Mommsen, of course, many years later, the great 19th century Roman scholar, spoke of diarchy, didn't he? And what I like about that is Garrett Fagan, who died recently, a brilliant Roman historian, he said, this is such wonderful evidence that 2,000 years later, Augustus was still fooling people. And that's what happens when you don't evaluate your sources, when you read Res Gestae like history, rather than reading it as kind of propaganda. Why would he love this term so much? Well, Garrett Fagan says that it was absolute power dressed up in warm, fuzzy language, okay? Suetonius tells us that he wept with emotion when the Senate gave him this particular title. It was his great title. He wanted to be the daddy. But listen to what Tacitus says. No honor was left for the gods when Augustus chose to be himself worshipped with temples and statues, like those of the deities, and with the flamens and the priests. So Tacitus felt as though the divine worship, the divine cult, very much began with Augustus. And of course, Tacitus, writing 100 years later, after the Caligulas and the Neros and everything, is furious. And he sees this as the corruption of the Republic, doesn't he? And he feels that it started with Augustus. Suetonius, on the other hand, is a lot more charitable than Tacitus. He tells us that he twice thought of restoring the Republic. Not quite sure how Suetonius knows that, but he confidently tells us. The first is after the defeat of Mark Antony. The second is in 23 BCE. And then what Suetonius says, reflecting, however, that as he himself would not be free from danger, so too it would be hazardous to trust the Senate, the state. Well, we could see this in different ways. We could say this is Suetonius being far too understanding. Or we could say, if we're going to be an apologist for Augustus, that actually there'd been this horrendous 100 years of civil war, the Republic had been breaking up, and that Augustus made a calculated decision that he could not return to the warlordism of the past. This is very interesting in Suetonius chapter 28 as well. May it be my privilege to establish the state in a firm and secure position and reap from that act the fruit I desire, but only if I may be called the author of the best possible government. Well, what's so interesting about that, I think, is the term author. Don't you guys think that that's the key? Because that, if that's a direct quote, contradicts res gestae. Here he is author, not restorer. Now, to me, author has connotations of creation and innovation. It's a different metaphor, isn't it? What does Tacitus tell us? Tacitus says, when the killing of Brutus and Cassius had disarmed the Republic. See how he puts it? Not restored the Republic, disarmed it. He goes on to say, after laying down his triumphal title and proclaiming himself a simple consul, content with tribunician authority to safeguard the commons, he first conciliated the army by gratuities, the money which is there in res gestae very clearly listed, the populace by cheapened corn, there in res gestae, he says it himself, that he continually gave handouts, the world by the amenities of peace. Well, that would be the closing of the gates of the temple of Janus, which he boasts about again. Then, step by step, began to make his ascent and to unite in his own person the functions of the Senate, the magistracy, and the legislature. Why I think this wording is really important, I want you to remember it. Step by step would suggest that this was a deliberate, tactical, logistical thing, so that the ascent to power. And remember that one of the big scholarly debates is, did he kind of feel his way to the Principate, or did he really carefully plan his way to the Principate? It would appear that Tacitus feels as though it was a careful, shrewd path there. Right, we come to the end. So in conclusion, the second settlement that we saw today in 23 BCE really consolidates his power. The Tribunician Potestas power will be really key, and future emperors and co-emperors will be given a share in this power. Why did he choose that? Well, it seems to me because it's not as prominent as the consul power. Of course, in 19 BCE, he gets the consul power and he gets the consul position without the title. This is really important. It means that the division between imperial and senatorial provinces is absolutely illusory. And in fact, Augustus rules all of the provinces. So, by 19 BCE, there is very little chance of restoring the Republic. Would it be reversible? It's difficult to imagine a return to the Republic, isn't it? And what's really important is the disguise of the power intensifies, doesn't it? Another thing that I want to remind you that Tacitus complains about is this concilium thing, isn't it? Power moving from the public domain of the Senate, from debate, argument, and kind of a dialogic structure, and to moving into the private sphere of the emperor, if that's what we want to call him, or the princeps, and his inner circle of advisors. Another thing that, of course, Tacitus despises is the growing influence of women. And on that sexist note, I will end.